Okay, so let's turn to talking about modern holidays. And, creating modern holidays is a very tricky thing to do because it's not always automatic that they get accepted. And sometimes they go in directions you didn't intend. And that's why I was mentioning earlier the example of Mother's Day. The inventor of Mother's Day created the holiday after her mother had died, and she was convinced her mother was a saint. And so she wanted to create a holiday to celebrate all mothers. And of course, the chocolate industry and the flowers industry and the greeting card industry loved the idea, and they jumped on it and commercialized it to the hilt. And this woman was appalled. She said, no, it's not a materialism day. She tried to cancel it. She said, forget it. No more Mother's Day. Stop, stop. It did no good, right? We still got Mother's Day. And guess which day the post office delivers the most mail? It's usually around Mother's Day. Too bad Father's Day gets it's way down the list for deliveries, but that's fine. Fathers get other perks. So the point is that Mother's Day went in a different direction the founder didn't want. Too bad. It's out there. It has a life of its own. Getting people to accept these days are challenging. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, as many of you know, was not accepted in a number of states early on. Some because they were worried about the number of days off, and others because they didn't really like Martin Luther King Jr. that much. Arizona was one of the last holdouts. They actually lost a Super Bowl because they refused to add that day as a state holiday. And actually a number of states, I found this out only in the last couple of years with the rise of racial justice work, made it a joint holiday of Martin Luther King and Robert E. Lee Day because their birthdays are close together. Yuck. But, so that's the complexities of adding a new holiday. Or the other example you might think of is Earth Day. And Earth Day was founded in the 1970s. It happens to be Hitler's birthday on April 20th in one of those weird conjunctions of, 1 in 365 odds of something happening like that. Just like Isaac Newton was born on December 25th. So you find quirks like that. So Hitler's birthday, AKA Earth Day, was founded in 1970, I think, with the desire of raising environmental awareness. And it was basically ignored for a long time by many sectors of society. It became more important as the environmental movement became more popularly aware in the 1990s. And I think it might be on a down. I don't know if people are doing as much Earth Day stuff now as they might have done even 10 or 15 years ago. But it's still out there as a possible day to observe. But it's a mixed acceptance. It's hard to start something new. And then you also have the challenge of dealing with old holidays and repurposing them. So, for example, there's a holiday in November we just had actually called Veterans Day. Does anyone know what Veterans Day used to be? James has a guess.
It was Armistice.
Yeah, Jenny L raised her hand. Also, just by Zoom, I assume they were going to say Armistice Day too, right? It's the 11th day, the 11th hour, when the guns fell silent. I've actually read, but I've not seen that there's a First World War Memorial in Australia dedicated to the veterans of the First World War, where there's a plaque on the floor, and the plaque says, "Greater love hath no man." And at 11 a.m. on November 11th every year, a ray of light shines on the word love in that building because they designed it exactly to fit that way. I found that, fantastic, great thinking, great design to work with its, celestial phenomena. But, you have to try to make meaning out of this day now because Armistice Day, what good is it after World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam? I mean, it's kept coming here. So you have to change it to Veterans Day. And so it has a different meaning. But then how different is it from Memorial Day? I guess Veterans Day is for living veterans and Memorial Day is for dead veterans. You have to sort of parse it out that way. And of course, Memorial Day now is much more for mattress sales and barbecues than it is actually about thinking about Memorial Day for many families. Not all, but for families that have veterans in them, Memorial Day may have more resonance, but or areas that send more people to the military. But in the liberal urban elite centers, Memorial Day is much more about sales and barbecues than it is about remembering fallen soldiers. we have a similar example in Jewish life. There used to be a holiday in November, called Balfour Day. Balfour Day was the date of the issuance of the Balfour Declaration. But today, Balfour Day is about as relevant as the date of the signing of the Articles of Confederation in the early colonial period. I mean, it's been superseded by the Constitution. It's not as, and the Balfour Day has been superseded by the declaration of the actual state, as opposed to a promise for a state sometime in the future. So Balfour Day also has sort of gone by the way. You actually was sort of amusing. When we visited Israel a couple of years ago, we talked to one of the settlers who lives in the West Bank, and he said that I do have one debt of gratitude to the Palestinians who live around me, because they always stone our buses on Balfour Day, so it reminds me that it's happening. Because for the Palestinians, it's a date of betrayal, and so they lash out. And so the armored buses that are traveling from the settlement to Israel proper get some stoning. And he says, why are they stoning us today? Oh, yeah, it's Balfour Day. So he sees it as a reminder. Again, the privilege involved in that should be highlighted. But in any case, sometimes we deal with old holidays by trying to make new holidays. You sort of have counter programming to the mainstream programming. One example of this is beginning in the 1950s, Congress and the presidency actually declare a national day of prayer on the first Thursday in May. It's obnoxious. It's not required. I mean, should you really be told you have to pray by the government? Is that really what the government should be in the business of doing? And the National Day of Prayer has a self-declared National Day of Prayer task force, which claims to be representing a Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's all really Christian. And of course, doesn't reflect either non-believers or believers in a non-Judeo-Christian religion. So it's very problematic. The American Humanist Association a number of years ago decided to create a counter program that they called the National Day of Reason, where they would try to get resolutions passed in Congress affirming the value of reason. And I don't know what they want people to do on the street, maybe, logic puzzles from the LSATs or something. I'm not sure exactly what they're hoping for. But I always found that to be a somewhat limited counter program, because it's saying everybody who prays is irrational. If ours is the National Day of Reason, then all you people who are praying are being unreasonable. So that's sort of a negative message. And the more important point is the humanist counterpart to prayer isn't reason. The humanist counterpart to prayer is action. It's doing something. I don't just pray, I go out and do something. You can pray and do something, or you can just do something, but just praying doesn't change the world as we understand. So a number of years ago, I actually proposed the idea of creating a National Day of Action, which ultimately was picked up by the, not the Freedom from Religion Foundation, it's Foundation Beyond Belief, which encourages both humanist charity giving and also doing charity works. They have something called the Beyond Belief Volunteer Network. And so they've tried to encourage people to do volunteer work in that, what they call the week of action, because a Thursday isn't always a great day to get people to do stuff. So anytime in that week, you could do something, and it's seen as a counter program, and I think a more effective counter program to the National Day of Prayer. Or another example is Palestinians have a day that they mark in May, on May 15th every year. They call it Nakba Day. Nakba Day means disaster day. It's their marking of the anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. But of course, they don't track it on the Jewish calendar, because why would they track it on the Jewish calendar? They track it on the general calendar, and so they mark it on May 15th every year, where Israeli Independence Day is not always on May 15th, because when Israel declared its Independence Day and tried to make it a new Jewish holiday universally, they put it on the Jewish calendar and not on the general calendar. So we're going to go back to our chart of calendars here, and you'll notice that in that spring period, basically during the Omer period, you have these three modern Israeli, modern Jewish holidays that have been added. You've got first on the 27th of Nisan, Yom Ha-Shoah, shortly after the end of Passover. You've got Yom Ha-Zikaron, which is Israeli Memorial Day. You might notice we use that phrase, Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, the memory of good people. That's Zikor, is to remember. So Yom Ha-Zikaron is Memorial Day for Israeli armed forces. And then the day after Memorial Day is Yom Ha-Atsmaut, the Day of Independence, again on the Jewish calendar, on the 5th of Iyar. Not always tied to May. You'll notice that Iyar can run from April to May. So in the year it happened, it was later on, and other years it'll be at the end of April. So let's talk about those three Israeli holidays that are added to the calendar. The first one is Yom Ha-Shoah v'Hagevurah, which is actually the full name of it. Shoah is a word that appears in the book of Job. It describes a kind of cosmic disaster destruction, which is appropriate for the Holocaust. But when Israel enacted the holiday in 1951, they wanted to call it something more uplifting. So it's called Yom Ha-Shoah v'Hagevurah, which means the day of disaster and heroism. So it remembers both the resistance as well as the destruction. As I said, it was established in 1951 by an act of the Knesset, so within 3 years of the founding of the state. And there were some other dates that were proposed for this. One date that was prominently chosen was the 19th of April, because that marked the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. You want to remember the day of disaster and heroism. Why not talk about the best Jewish revolt that took place in a ghetto, even under hopeless circumstances? And that would have been the 19th of April. The problem, though, is that the 19th of April in 1943 was the evening before Passover. It was the 14th of Nisan. So could you really do your Independence Day at the beginning of Passover? Well, again, can you repurpose it that much? Probably not that much. So that wouldn't work. And as I mentioned, some in the Orthodox world said we don't need a separate Yom Ha-Shoah. We don't need a separate Holocaust Day. We have Disaster Day. It's Tisha B'Av that remembers all those other destructions. So let's include it with that. We already have the destruction of the first temple, destruction of the second temple. We remember the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the 1600s. We remember the Inquisition. We'll remember Amalek. We're going to remember the disaster of the Holocaust that day as well. So when you have Yom HaShoah observances, you get the modern Orthodox participating, the traditional Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, secular Jews, but the ultra-Orthodox are not, because it's a modern observance imposed by this modern secular Israeli state that they don't necessarily recognize. What happens as part of Yom HaShoah? Well, you have the lighting of candles in many places. A number of campus organizations will sponsor a reading of names, where you just recite names for a period of several hours. Some will draw on the fact that the vast majority of Jews who died in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers and from a land that was the heartland of Yiddish culture. So reading Yiddish poetry might be prominent. There's a song called Zognit Kainmol, Never Say That You Are on the Final Road is the translation. And it was written in the Vilna Ghetto in response to hearing about the Warsaw Ghetto. So it's sometimes called the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion song. It's actually the Vilna Ghetto song, but was written in response to hearing about Warsaw. And that is often sung at these observances, and it's traditional to stand for that as well. In Israel, they've also instituted a very interesting public observance because, of course, there it's a Jewish state. They can impose public observance of holidays. And so what they do is they, at a certain point in the middle of the day, they blow an air raid siren for 2 minutes. I've got a video of what it looks like when that happens. This is on a major highway in Tel Aviv, but I think you'll agree with me. It's a very striking scene to see what people do during those 2 minutes. So you can see it's very striking to have that siren sound. People stop their cars, they stand at attention, they don't talk, they're not checking their phones. I mean, it really is a very meaningful observance in that space for those people. Now, again, it depends on where you are. If you're in Haifa, you'll see people keep walking around because Haifa has a substantial Arab population. They might not stop to celebrate or to observe that, or they might do it in solidarity with their friends and neighbors who have might have Holocaust survivors in their family, or simply it's marking an observance of solidarity with the mourning of the Jewish people. So that's Yom Ha-Shoah in Israel, as well as examples of what we do in diaspora. The next example is the next holiday rather is Yom Ha-Zikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, which takes place again on the 4th of Iyar, the day just before Independence Day on the 5th. Again, they sound the air raid siren for 2 minutes. There's a special lighting of candles on that day. But what I find most interesting about the choice of Israeli Memorial Day is that they set it the day before Independence Day. Imagine if American Memorial Day were on July 3rd. I think it would get a lot more attention for what it was intended for. And imagine how it would impact July 4th. It would make you feel very differently about that holiday. And again, there's a rationale for that in Israel because the vast majority of the population, again, outside of the Arab population and the ultra-Orthodox population, serves in the army and often knows people and had people in their high schools who died. In fact, most high schools will have a memorial wall with the names of people who went to that school who've died in military service, or sometimes also in terrorism attacks. They sometimes collide those two. And again, this is something established in the early years of the state, which makes sense because in the War of Independence in 48 to 49, something like 1% of the entire Jewish population of the state died. I mean, there were 600,000 Jews, about 6,000 Jews died in that War of Independence. And it was a full 1% of the then population of the country. I mean, that would be like 3 million Americans dying in a War of Independence. So you might well establish that as a Memorial Day close to Independence Day. But as the Memorial Day closes, as sundown, it turns into Independence Day in Israel. And this, of course, starts in 1948 with the first Independence Day. And what you find in diaspora communities, there are a few liturgical pieces that have been added to the prayer book, a prayer for the state of Israel and so on, that are highlighted. But more often than not, what you'll find are Israel Solidarity Day marches and parades or events like that. Sometimes there are public community space events organized by the Jewish federations or the umbrella Jewish organizations rather than synagogue-based events. In Israel, they have a military parade, they have fireworks. It's actually a very popular day to go to the mall because it's a day off, but it's not Shabbat, so things might be open. It depends on the space, of course, for that. Of course, one of the complications with Israeli Independence Day is it does highlight the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. It aspires to being a democratic state based on many of the statements in the Declaration of Independence, although it doesn't use the word democracy there, unfortunately. But it talks about toleration and freedom of religion and all kinds of other positive things. No discrimination, including on the basis of sex, which is one step up from the US Constitution. But there's this inevitable tension between being a state of all its citizens, including its Arab and Muslim citizens, or its Christian citizens for that matter, and being the Jewish state. There are plenty of other ethnic states, by the way. Israel is by far not the only ethnic state. And in some states, it's illegal to be non-Muslim. So, again, Israel is not unique in this. Sometimes it gets unique attention for whatever reason. But if you look at the Israeli national anthem, it is something worth thinking about, that for Jews to sing it, it may be very comfortable and inspiring. But if you were a non-Jewish person and this were your national anthem, I don't know how you'd feel about it. In fact, this became a controversy some years ago when traditionally there's been an Arab member of the Israeli Supreme Court, sort of a seat set aside for that, just like there was the Jewish seat on the US Supreme Court for a period of time. Now we have 3, so I think that's out of the way. But in Israel, they have this Arab seat on the Supreme Court. And at one point, people got mad because this Supreme Court justice would stand for the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva, but wouldn't sing it. But when you look at what the words mean, you can see why he wouldn't sing it. Still in the heart, deep inside, the Jewish soul longs, and towards the east raises an expected eye to Zion. That's the ancient name for that mountain in Jerusalem that stands in for the whole city. Still has not passed our hope, the hope of 2,000 years. Again, our hope is Tikvatenu, Hatikva, the hope of 2,000 years to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and the city of Jerusalem. So a song that speaks of the Jewish soul and that uses the traditional Hebrew term Zion for this. Notice the flag also I put here with a Jewish star on it. I mean, it's attention, right? I mean, there are plenty of Muslim countries that have the Muslim crescent on their flag. And you might notice there are even crosses built into a number of European country flags, Denmark and the UK and a number of other, and Sweden, right? You've got crosses built into the flags. So is it that wrong for the Jews to have their own state? Well, this is one of those debates that goes on between the universalism of human rights and, again, democracy for all its citizens, and the desire to have a state where Jews can articulate their ethnic identity as the majority culture, to be able to make a public observance like Yom Ha-Shoah, where it's public air raid sirens that are sounding and not a private synagogue setting. Well, there's something to be said for cultural self-expression in a majority way, which was part of the motive behind the Zionist movement to begin with. And then there are complications like this. So you get plenty of other debates around this. And if you look at the calendar as a whole, this is the last one we're going to come to at the end. If you look at the calendar as a whole, again, you'll notice that there are a few dates added to that calendar more recently. One is called Yom Yerushalayim Jerusalem Day, which marks the conquest of East Jerusalem in 1967 as part of the Six-Day War. That's also become a flashpoint holiday because often you get these right-wing protesters who insist on walking through the Muslim quarter of East Jerusalem with their flags and saying this is ours, and it creates a lot of tension in the city. There were some riots even this year around that day. And in 1995, and another sad note, another holiday was added. It's called Rabin Memorial Day, because on the 4th of November or the 12th of Cheshvan, Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister who had tried to make some peace with the Palestinians and with Syria for that matter, was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli Jewish zealot. And so now on Rabin Memorial Day, you'll also have a special observance. People go to the square where he was speaking, which is now called Kikar Rabin, Rabin Square, and they'll light candles and they'll sing the song that he sang, a Shir L'Shalom, a song for peace. And they remember it's only 26 years ago, that moment when there was a lot of hope, and then that hope began to die. And it's sort of the death of the long, slow death of the Oslo peace process. You can point to that date. So some people mark Rabin Memorial Day. Again, not universally. The right wing, they might give out cake on Rabin Memorial. I mean, they're not upset on that day in the way that the liberal secular population is. But this is the reality of holidays in Jewish life now, where not everybody is going to do everything. And that's also worth pointing out. And I see your hand, Bron. I'll get you in 1 second. It's worth pointing out when someone says to you, well, the Orthodox do everything. Some of them don't do Yom Ha-Shoah, and some of them don't do Rabin Memorial Day. And, so if we don't do the fast of Tevet, well, we've made our choice out of the Jewish calendar too. Yeah, Brian, you were going to ask something?
Just a comment. The expectant eye is looking to the east. So if you're Mizrahi, I mean, what goes on here?
Very good point. If you're from the Eastern diaspora, in fact, Mizrahi has the word Mizrach, east, built into it. If you're an Eastern Jew living east of Palestine, east of that land, east of the land, the historic land of Palestine or Canaan or whatever you want to call it, you're looking west. It's exactly right that this is a song written from a European perspective, and technically it's like east-southeast, if you're like, doing the map right, if you want to be picky about it. But exactly right. This is an Ashkenazi framed message that might not speak to the Mizrahi soul. Now, the challenge is there are still Jews living in the Western diaspora. And also, by the way, if you think about it as a globe, like which way do the Australians look? I mean, they're looking sort of north and whatever. And they could go either way around. You can go either way and see it in theory. You get there either way. But it's a very European-centric phrasing of this, and it was written by a European Zionist. So for Jews in America, we would still look east to go there, but Jews in other parts of the world wouldn't. And for Mizrahi Jews, exactly, it's a very good point. They wouldn't see it that way. So again, these are opportunities for us to celebrate. There isn't a history of religiosity connected to these, so we don't have to like unpack or reframe them directly. Although there are some of our communities or members who might not be comfortable going to an Israeli Solidarity Day or a We Support Israel March without ambiguity or without complication. They would want some, framing of that or hedging of that. Because if there's going to be speakers at that event, what are the speakers going to say? And that becomes very fraught and challenging. If you're doing a Yom Ha-Shoah community event, do they want to say Kaddish? They probably want to say Kaddish. Are they open to having a poem where you're angry at God? Maybe. Are they open to Zognit Kainmol? They better be. So that actually comes out of that period in that population. So it's going to be a negotiating act. If you're going to be part of a general community event for a holiday like Yom Ha-Shoah or Yom Ha-Zikaron or Yom Ha-Atsmaut, you're going to have to, not have it exactly the way you want it and have some compromise, or you can create new rituals connected to these. So one idea that a friend of mine had, who was studying our rabbinic program, but tragically died before he was done, and he was basing this on what some other people had done in Israel, is to create a new Megillah reading for Israeli Independence Day. Because in Israel, they don't call it the Declaration of Independence. They call it Megillat Ha-Atsmaut, the Scroll of Independence, just like the Megillat Esther, the Scroll of Esther. And so what he would do is, let's read the scroll of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was written and signed on this day. One of the quirky things, by the way, is they agreed to the text, but they hadn't put it in nice calligraphy, so they signed a blank piece of paper. And then later on, someone went and filled it in with calligraphy for the official version, but then when they signed it, it was actually blank. So interesting, quirk of history. They're rebuilding actually the place where they signed it in Tel Aviv, and it should be a great museum in a couple of years. Or it might already be open. I don't know if the new version is up yet. Anyway, so his idea was, let's read this Megillah, let's read this scroll. We don't have to boo and cheer, like you do for Purim and Esther, but make that an observance and talk about the values described there and how have we done, have we met these goals? Independence is really a work in progress, and this would be an annual check-in to see, is this still relevant to us, and what inspiration do we get from this or not? So, that would certainly work for secular Jews, because God doesn't appear anywhere in the Megillah of Independence. It refers obliquely to the rock of Israel at the very end, which could mean the rock that is Israel, or a euphemism for God. But it even says at the beginning that it's the Hebrew people that wrote the Bible. The Jewish people gave the world those book of books when they were last independent. So it's a relatively secular document, and that way we can, again, connect with it, grapple with it, see some flaws in it, but also find inspiration in it too. So there are all kinds of opportunities for us. I will also conclude with this passage, and then we'll have a chance for comments, questions, whatever, that appears in the rabbinic sources in a section of the Mishnah at the very end of describing the holidays. It describes the 15th of Av. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were no days of joy in Israel greater than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. On these days, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out in borrowed white garments in order not to shame anyone who had none. All these garments required immersion in the mikveh. The daughters of Jerusalem came out and danced in the vineyards. Sorry for the tense there. What would they say? Young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. Do not set your eyes on beauty, but set your eyes on the family. Grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands and let her works praise her in the gates. So this sounds a lot like a fertility rite, doesn't it? They all get dressed in white garments that are specially pure. They all wear the same borrowed white garments, so you can't tell who comes from a rich family and a poor one. They dance in the vineyards and invite young men to lift up their eyes and look at them. I mean, well. It is interesting also that the joy of the 15th of Av, and again, note 15th means full moon. The joy of the 15th of Av is compared to the joy of Yom Kippur. What do you mean, the joy of Yom Kippur? Well, Yom Kippur is the day of the forgiveness of sins. And if at the end your sins are forgiven and you've been written in the book of life for a new year, then it may be a very good day after all. So what kind of new holidays could we make for diaspora Jews? If we wanted to mark something that does not focus on Israel and is not defined by the Israeli Knesset. I mean, there were members of the non-Zionist Jewish left that insisted on keeping April 19th as their Holocaust Memorial Day and refused to recognize Yom Ha-Shoah. They said, we're going to do the Warsaw Ghetto Day. That's when we're going to remember the Holocaust. And so they tried to maintain that as a counter program. In the end, because it's so close to Passover, it didn't work out as well. But what could we choose? Well, the Jewish labor movement for a long time had May 1st. May Day was a big day. You don't think of May Day as a Jewish holiday, but if you were in a Jewish labor union, May Day became a Jewish holiday. There is also what I call Chinese Food and Movies Day, AKA December 25th, right?
Isaac Newton's birthday.
Or right, Newton's birthday, exactly. Newtonmas, as some people call it. So you could do, mark that in some way. And actually some communities make it a Jewish community service day where they volunteer to deliver food and they do, because the other charities might not have as many volunteers because people are having family time. It's also, if you're in medical school, it's Jews and Hindus and Muslims work day. And, so they give the Christians the day off and then the interns, swap out for other holidays for the other religious groups. So it's, hard to find a Christian intern day at the hospital. But for Jews, it could be a sort of negative grumble day of, well, Chinese food is all that's open. But for a lot of people, it becomes a kind of festive. Hey, it's our Chinese food and movies day. We're going to watch like 3 movies all day. And or it's an opportunity for community service. Even in Israel, they have this problem because people want to observe New Year's Eve, like the universal New Year's Eve. But it's not New Year's Eve in Israel because New Year's is the 1st of Tishrei in the fall. It's not middle of January, middle of the winter. So what they call it is Sylvester. Because if you know your Catholic saints, December 31st is Saint Sylvester Day. And so in Israel, they jokingly call New Year's Eve Sylvester, and they might have Sylvester parties because they're not going to call it New Year's, but everybody knows what it's for, and they can watch fireworks, and they have their Sylvester parties that way. So if we wanted to make a new one, again, I mentioned earlier, Jewish Book Month or Jewish Heritage Month, or we could try to pick that. And I did try to find out, and I was unable to find a clear date which could work as an American Jewish holiday, unique American Jewish holiday. In 1654, a boat arrived from the colony of Recife, which had been Dutch and had been taken over by the Portuguese. Actually, I think it had been Portuguese, they had been conquered by the Dutch and then reconquered by the Portuguese. And the Jews had to flee because they had admitted they had been faking it when they were claiming to be Christians. And they went to another Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, AKA New York. They arrived in early September of 1654. But I am unable to find, and I don't think anyone can find the exact day that they arrived in early September, because it just references them being there at a later point in the month. Peter Stuyvesant writes a letter back to Holland to say, what do I do with these people I don't want later in September? But we don't know, when they arrived exactly. And the other problem with picking a date in early September is, guess what else shows up often in early September? Rosh Hashanah. Oh, well. So this would become like the Fast of Gedalia, slapped in the middle of the high holidays. But maybe if the rabbis can add the Fast of Gedalia on the 3rd day, of the month, let's pick the 5th day, or the 6th day of the new year. And we'll make that New Amsterdam Day. And that will be celebrating the experience of Jews in America. All too often we make Jewish institutions for the wrong things. We have the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is dedicated in the early 90s, and the Museum of American Jewish History doesn't open until the 2010s. Let's do it the other way around this time. I mean, we have Yom Ha-Shoah, let's do that, but let's make something for American Jews too. So any last thoughts, comments, or questions? Yeah, James.
Whatever the date with the George Washington's like letter to the Toro synagogue would also be a good, and that's probably an easier date to find.
Yes, I'm sure he dated the letters. Yes, that would be easier. You could read the letter, it becomes a whole ritual. And yeah, so that's another candidate, is the famous letter George Washington wrote to the Toro synagogue in Rhode Island.